Okay, whatever you got.
That's good.
Sure.
Greetings, everyone. Daniel back again. So here we are with a little meetup with the SGPP. Not that we need another acronym, but with the study groups on psychoanalysis and politics. So first of all, thanks to everyone that has been supporting our work. We have almost 100 supporters on the Patreon, which is amazing. We have a partnership with this YouTube page from Zero Books, which has a large subscriber base, which has been nice to kind of expand some of the videos. Gabriel Tupinambá and I did a recent video on the future of the Lacanian left, which was quite kind of new, experimental, and tried a different approach. I thought it went quite well. We expect like 3 more installments of this particular approach. And then I've been doing a lot of interviews with different philosophers and kind of scholars that look at this broad intersection of psychoanalysis and politics. And so tonight we just wanted to brainstorm with you all. We have seminars up on the horizon as well. I also have been receiving different ideas for other study sessions we can do, which I can raise with you all at some point later. But I thought I would take advantage of bringing together Khadijah Diskin, who's a researcher in areas of psychoanalysis, race. I imagine, and I noticed from Googling you, Khadijah, which is always quite weird to confess that you, but that's the world, that's the world we live in. So no shame there. But nonetheless, you have a big interest in Frantz Fanon, and I want to learn more about psychoanalysis, because I think part of what we're doing and part of what the current moment politically feels like, at least to me, and this might be a question for all of us, and starting with Khadijah perhaps, is kind of like this strange moment of a kind of reflection as it pertains to what psychoanalysis is good for the left. What psychoanalysis and politics might actually achieve. What kind of, what exactly is that relation? And I know Gabriel has actually written a book on this question in part, but I've been seeing a lot of people even throw into question, like, what's the legacy of the new left? What does it mean when Lacanian theory attaches to a liberation movement, a working class movement, a left-wing movement? What's the history there? What has gone well? What hasn't gone well? So feels to me as if we're in a moment of a kind of re-evaluation in some way. And obviously that's kind of, I think, the mission of this network we're trying to launch, is precisely to kind of pose those questions. And I feel like the time is right to pose those big questions. So Khadijah, can you tell the group about introduce yourself, your research, but also like maybe what do you think about this problem of psychoanalysis and politics, and what do you find useful?
So I'm quite new to psychoanalysis. I kind of came to it during my thesis because my supervisors had written a paper using Lacan's 4 discourses to analyze the sort of effects of neoliberalism on the student subject. And I think what they were really interested in was thinking through sort of intersubjectivity and what was this sort of contradiction at the heart of the kind of student experience. And so I took on that kind of challenge, but I wanted to perhaps unpack it in a sort of different way. And because my background is on like race, specifically Blackness, I wanted to look at like the Black student subjects, because whilst I agreed with a lot of the conclusions they had in their research, I felt like through my own experience and through what I know of Black students, the findings that they came to weren't findings that I thought would actually apply. So I wanted to sort of like use both sort of psychoanalysis and empirical research to unpack what the kind of student subjective as a Black student meant, and what sort of Blackness within a neoliberal context meant, especially within the university context, when we're seeing a sort of concentration of the kind of marketized politics that are constantly being drilled to students. So that's kind of what led me down my research path. And it's been somewhat of a challenge, because I think trying to do the types of, and firstly, I should add, there are many ways to do Lacanian psychoanalysis, and there are many Lacans even. So one can take on the project of looking at specifically like how Lacan articulates subjectivity, and the three registers of consciousness that Lacan speaks of, and that will take you down a specific route of Lacan. You can perhaps focus simply on the four discourses, which is basically kind of a look at how the sort of larger ideological forces that exist within the world then become internalized and sort of, engaged with on the subjective level. So that I think drew me to Lacan. That made me feel as though I could do something with Lacan. But the challenge then that was posed was, well, then how do I intersect Blackness with that kind of project? And that led me to Fanon. And of course, I'd read Fanon before, but I hadn't read Fanon through like a psychoanalytic lens. And I think that it's really interesting that, many people oftentimes kind of link Fanon to Lacan in a very specific way. I think it's a bit overstated. I think Fanon doesn't actually talk about Lacan much. And when Fanon does talk about Lacan, he's specifically speaking of the mirror stage and the contradictions in the sort of like development of the Black self when it goes through the mirror stage. So then I started to read just more kind of like texts on Blackness, and I tried to find a thread of Lacan somewhere, something that could substantiate the type of work I was doing. That led me to Du Bois, that led me to Sylvia Wynter, and I had to do a kind of critical reading of their work through a lens of psychoanalysis to actually get the psychoanalysis out of it. Because when you tend to read work on Blackness, work on race, it tends to be work and scholarship on race. And there's never really been a sort of like large discourse that emphasizes the possibilities of psychoanalysis within the realm of sort of Black studies and studies of Black kind of subjectivities. And reading Du Bois's The Soul of Black Folk kind of sparked something into me, because I felt like, although not articulating it as such, and although speaking of the soul, he was speaking of consciousness, he was speaking of subjectivity, he was speaking of the challenges of Blackness that meant that Black enslaved people lived these dual lives, where they knew at the core of their being that they were human, but lived their lives in service and under enslavement, which required a sort of splitting of their subjective. And similar, Sylvia Wynter does this work thinking through what Black consciousness is, what it means to be a Black person throughout the various stages of kind of the conceptions of humanity. And she kind of cites Lacan kind of lightly when talking about the kind of subjective experience of Black folk. And so that's where I found my thread. I was like, okay, so my project now is about Blackness and meaning and how Blackness can be understood through the lens of subjectivity. And of course, Lacan's subjectivity was really interesting for me. And I began to think of Lacan less as concept, more as method. So what I mean here is that instead of looking at the conceptual frameworks for psychoanalysis he provides us, I believe that his work specifically on the four discourses gives us something really unique, because Lacan, in his sort of articulations of the subjective, gives us a conundrum. We have the three registers, the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. And of course, the imaginary and the real have an interactional problem, but the symbolic is where the interaction becomes rendered possible. But this kind of interaction through the symbolic is never sort of a true image of the reality. It's always a symbolic image, it's always a sort of reflection. And for Lacan, language was one of the most powerful means through which we can understand the sort of symbolic. So that's where I decided to think of Lacan as a methodological kind of prospect, think of doing empirical research and using Lacanian discourse analysis to unpack that subjective. And right now I'm in the sort of data collection, early data analysis phase, and it has been, just as exciting as I thought it would be, just as interesting as I thought it would be, and just as challenging as I thought it would be. So when I think about, I guess, psychoanalysis and what it has to offer the left today, I think instead of looking at psychoanalysis as a sort of tool of kind of learning about psychopathology or, treatment or therapy, we can use psychoanalysis actually as a method for understanding the kind of current contradictions in which we're in. And I think the current moment that we're in, and why the left, I would argue, is in such a mess, is that for a long time, we perhaps have focused on the economic and the material in a particular way. And we've kind of forgotten the political, meaning the ideological, meaning the sort of the desire, meaning the things that actually kind of make people tick, the things that are not immediately sort of obvious to us. So then for me, our work as psychoanalysts is to work through the contradiction that the ideological presents to us, work through the obfuscations that are presented to us, because in this current moment, what we're seeing as the material reality is not reflected in the consciousness of the populace. So that's for me where psychoanalysis, I believe, can be mobilized in an effective way.
Amazing ground that you've covered there, Khadijah. And
quite a lot.
You also go by Dij, right?
Yeah, I go by Dij.
Okay, and your Twitter handle is Fanon is canon, which is a beautiful. That's a great idea for a Twitter handle.
I didn't make it up. It's from a Rage Against the Machine lyric.
Oh, is it really? Oh my god. Oh my God. No, I really appreciate the point you made that Fanon is not a Lacanian, because there's a tendency to say, oh yeah, he's just a Lacanian, and say, oh, well, what does that actually mean? Actually, no. Because it takes away from the originality of his own thought. When you do that, I think that's a problem on the one hand. On the other hand, he builds on Lacan and goes in really different directions as well. So there's a lot to be said about that. And I really appreciate what you just concluded on, and I wanted to invite Gabriel to jump into this conversation as well. Apropos this question of politics, ideology. Now, Gabriel, in your work, to build on what Dij is saying around this kind of the discourses, just for the benefit of everyone on this meeting, Gabriel is not a fan of the discourse theory, actually. So I'm going to only because he's my very good comrade, put him on the spot and ask him to maybe in reality, honestly, because I think it's interesting to build off of Gabriel's critique of what we might say, some of the theoretical, the ways that Lacanian theory or Lacanianism has developed what he calls a Lacanian ideology. So
I would agree.
Let's talk about the Lacanian ideology, Gabriel. And in response,
but before we can talk about my opinion about things, can I just ask something, because I'm really, really interested in your research. You said that, sorry to totally take it somewhere else, but you mentioned that, so there was somebody studying the contradictions of the student experience, but you felt like this didn't apply to the experience of Black students. Could you just mention a bit more like what you felt like, okay, this is not really doing it, you know?
So in the wonderful research that was done by my PhD supervisors, actually, that then allowed me to do this PhD because they won an award and it became like the conditions of my funding, they were using the 4 discourses to analyze the student subject, and specifically looking at the way the students had internalized what they believed to be various discourses of the university. So the master discourse being the discourse of the neoliberal university, the student as a customer, the degree as a product, the university discourse being the bureaucratic discourse of the university that then also can be internalized by students, thinking, oh, if you just do the right processes, if you follow the right rules, you'll be successful. They had a hysteric discourse, which I actually disagree with. I think the hysteric discourse of the student was actually more of a analyst discourse. Which was, students who were in disarray, who were angry at the university in a particular way, who thought the university operated in an unjust manner and a manner that, didn't serve the purposes of things like social justice. And then they had the analyst discourse of the student, which was students who kind of knew what they were doing and knew how to kind of like work their way through it and understood that the degree wasn't an endpoint. And I felt like it didn't apply for Black students, especially the notion of, and because in the cohort of students they interviewed, majority of the students existed within the intersubjective position of the master discourse and the hysteric discourse. So the first problem for me, because I always put a critical eye, is how were they coming up with the master discourse? What does the master discourse in this way mean? And that I felt that the idea that if a student discussed themselves as a customer, as, wanting to get this end product of a degree, that's what they then associate with the student kind of inhabiting a master discourse. I don't feel like that applies to Black students. I feel like it doesn't actually apply to a lot of students because I speak to students mostly. Because I think
bonkers, yes.
And whilst, you know, some students definitely do, and there is, especially in this year that I've been teaching, I've seen a huge shift in how students think about themselves and how students engage in the process of pedagogy in a way that has troubled me and has shocked me. I didn't think it applies to Black students, and my research, as far as I am at, is kind of proving this, because they just don't think of themselves as customers. Because, and I think one of the people I interviewed said this, like, what am I buying? Like, this is torture. You know, this experience is horrifying. They give me nothing. I get no support. I had to fight my way in here. And I had to pretend to be something I wasn't just to get in. So that was where, for me, when they were sort of making these claims, I was like, I don't know, because as a Black student myself too, I don't think I internalized the idea of a sort of, you know, neoliberal student who was going in there to get a degree. And that was just this product that I was buying. And I think a lot of that had to do, and in the initial stages of my research, I was interested in the concept of like educational desire amongst especially like Black people. And obviously the Black population in the UK is very specific. We tend to be from immigrant families. We tend to be first or second generation immigrants. And we have a particular sort of like socialization about education. We have a particular value attached to education, where constantly many of us are told that education isn't for you. You have to fight for it. You have to work hard for it. The university isn't a space with you in mind. So you have to become the person that needs to, you know, work hard for it. That's always been the logic that we've kind of been told. And so the idea that students would just think of themselves as customers just didn't ring true for me. And I thought, if it didn't ring true for me and the people that I talked to, then perhaps we need to think about this project differently. Perhaps in the context of the neoliberal university, Blackness means something, and we need to explore what that means. The student subject means something different if we apply this racialized lens to it too. And so I wanted to kind of take on that task of inquiring and finding out. And I think, and I said this to my supervisors, much to their disapproval, that my work is not a continuation from theirs, it's actually a critique of theirs. So I'm taking the concepts and their findings and I'm putting them up for scrutiny. I'm saying, okay, what is this thing we're doing? What is this notion of the student embodying an intersubjective position that deems them a hysteric or a master? Like, what does that actually mean? Does the data that I'm going to be looking at, does the empirical data tell me that?
That's so amazing.
That is fascinating.
No, this is so fascinating. And tell you why this interests me so much, because it started around 2016. I was part of a collective that started a project at public universities in Brazil, which was called, I'm not sure how you translate it to English, like academic workshop or something like this. But workshop in Portuguese, you have a word for it that sounds more like a kind of a place where you fix cars, you know, not workshop in this kind of already academic sense, oficina, right? So, which was a project meant to deal with the fact that we had the impression that both the theory and the sort of mechanisms that were available to deal with suffering at university of especially poor and especially Black students in Brazil were totally missing the mark, for a very similar reason to the one you're saying, which I mean, ended up, was a very big part in the sort of practical experience of how Lacanians can go wrong with just throwing some concepts onto the world, like just shoving it, because
concepts.
Exactly, because it seemed like while in clinical work we tend to be quite aware that you shouldn't trust what people say, but where they're saying it from really matters. When it came to listening to students, there was absolutely no capacity to at least take into consideration that there's a big difference between students who are really identified, for example, with the customer discourse, and those who are saying it to get by, or those who are just, you know, performing something while they're clearly aware they're somewhere else, you know, and they need to be in this in-between place. So I was part of a project for a long time. It lasted until just the end of last year. Then I left. The project still exists, but that tried to organize students around this issue. The idea that, and in Brazil, we have a very specific situation because public universities are generally leftist in a certain sense. The expansion of public universities was a project of the Workers' Party. You will find a lot of students, organizations, leftist movements inside the university. And weirdly enough, that seemed to make things worse, not better. Which was crazy because people would get into the university. I mean, just to give two examples of problems, I'm not sure if you find these problems as well in the research you're doing, but one of them was you would join, for example, the university is free, but free, you still need to pay 2 bus fares, buy crazy expensive books, pay for lunch outside of your home and so on. So it's not really free for most people. And that's really challenging. And on top of that, you're the first person in your family to ever go to university. You feel like a ridiculously kind of high pressure that other students are not feeling. And, you know, you look at like the bibliography of a course, it has like 10 books. The teacher is pretending like he's going to teach 10 books. Students are pretending like they're going to read 10 books, but nobody told you should pretend. So you're like trying to read 10 books on a bus before work that you're still working afterwards. So it's a totally crazy situation, but even the leftist discourse in the university is not ready to absorb it because students are meant to be all in the same place defending public universities. So if you suffer, you're automatically excluded from the group you're trying to participate. So that was a huge thing. And the second problem was also, especially in the Black movement in Brazil, student Black movement, students who would come from very complicated peripheral situations, they would join the university, they would become more explicitly politicized once they joined. But then when they went back home in the weekend, suddenly they found out that even though, you know, their family is Black, they're quite conservative, and suddenly they can no longer speak to the community they came from, but they're also not part of the community they're joining. So again, they're trapped in these two things. Our parlance to deal with that was that people are trapped in more than one world, but less than two. You can't really engage in both, but you can't really choose one. You'll never be able to go back, but you're not fully integrated in the other thing. And I mean, we totally lacked theoretical resources to deal with that. We were always just improvising stuff. So I'd love to read what you're writing. I'm not sure how different the contexts are, but I feel like we need to get ready because this sort of thing is going to get worse and worse. And absolutely. One of the problems we have, and this leads to Daniel's question, is that if we felt lost, like people in the, you know, with psychoanalytic, theoretical, leftist inclinations, if we felt lost explaining this, it would be better because at least there would be some actual listening to people. But we think we already nailed the problem, like these big words like neoliberalism, and now everyone is a client. Everyone thinks they are entrepreneur, you know, or something like this. And it totally misses the kind of social geography of how the same discourse in the mouth of different people means totally different things, right? But my impression, and that's kind of what I think we can do, and that's how I tend to think we should supplement Lacan as a method when dealing with social phenomena. The reason why this happens, in my opinion, is because Lacanians don't know what is the correlate of a position of enunciation outside of the clinic. In the clinic, it's clear, like the person paid, like laid on the couch, and now they're saying something crazy. Like, I see where you are, man. Like, you're here. I know where you're speaking from. But in social life, creating a position of enunciation is called politics. It's about actual concrete organization of people, and Lacanians couldn't care less about that in general. So they only get the surface, which is can only analyze what people are saying, and like you can't get that far with that, you know. It's against their own method in a way. So I say it's my method. I mean, I'm unfortunately one of those people. So I do think that what you said, I mean, I think it's a perfect example. I mean, you know more about this better than I do. Like exactly what she said, Daniel. That's what the thing she's criticizing. That's what I call Lacanian ideology. Like,
yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, Yeah, that's the first thing I felt. So when I read this project, which was mostly done on white students, I was just like, we're assuming a lot of things here, you know? And even the line of questioning that was taken and the sort of inspirational text that they followed, I was just like, no. So my work then for me becomes decolonial, and it becomes decolonial not because it's, you know, doing this, you know, de-radicalized version of, you know, whatever the university calls decolonial these days. It's decolonial because it's taking what the West views as canon. It's taking the canon of psychoanalysis, and specifically Lacanian psychoanalysis, and the variety of work that develops from it, right? Because we can even put Althusser in there, and, you know, the concepts of interpolation that he develops from Lacan. I'm putting these things up for scrutiny. I'm saying, okay, for a long time, Lacanians, and this is the problem I have with Lacanians, have disregarded the empirical, they've disregarded the real, they've disregarded the lived, insofar as it curates and creates meanings that are oftentimes very specific to people, and said that we have these answers because we're clinicians and we can use our clinical methodologies to basically just analyze swaths of populations that we may not even know, right? And what I'm arguing, and what is inspired by Du Bois and Fanon, is that, you know, Blackness cultivates a whole different set of meanings within the world. So the assumption that we can apply a meaning developed in a very specific context in France to Black students who are not just Black students, they're immigrants who are, you know, cultivating their own and actually creating their own new meaning of Blackness, is what I'm finding, that even the term Blackness that we use is quite abstractive. Blackness has no fixed meaning, it shifts through space and time. They're cultivating their own new meanings of Blackness and their own new meanings of what it means to be a student. And so it's through them that I interrogate these concepts. And so I've thought of my project as decolonial because I'm not assuming the conceptual frameworks that I'm talking about are going to apply. I'm actually saying this is what's up for scrutiny. If the students only know a master discourse because they are so ideologically worn down by the marketing strategies of the university, they will tell me that, or I will be able to unpack that through their experience. And I've got to say, I've done quite a few interviews and not a single Black student has said they view themselves as a customer. Not a single one. Not a single one. Not a single one.
Yeah.
I mean, many of them understand the university is a business, but they don't view themselves as customers of that business. They view themselves as workers. They view themselves as part of the exploited class, which I think just opens a whole new role for thinking through, you know, how students are creating these kind of different forms of meaning around their experience, that because of the kind of, you know, doctrine of what we think neoliberalism is and what it does, we're not actually unpacking that. We're just saying, well, students are all under the thumb of neoliberalism and they're experiencing this the exact same way.
Can I just ask another question? Sorry, Daniel, let me interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Just because I'm really interested in this. Sorry, guys, I'm totally hijacking. Let's just interview her, which is nicer.
That actually was partially the goal here. You
perfect,
good.
Perfect.
But it's very serendipitous that I neglected to piece together the fact that Gabriel had done all the student research himself, and it really dovetails quite nice.
You only care about the fact I don't like the four discourses. That's the only thing.
That is
that. Listen when I say.
You got me on that.
But one thing I wanted to, do you think it's, I'm not sure if this is verifiable, but is it possible to find out, for example, if students who talk to you in one way, talked to the previous inquiries and the others in a different way, you know, like.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, so part of this work, I'm also doing autoethnographic work, right? Because I think the idea that me and myself and my position and the meaning that I bring doesn't then obscure the types of answers I get and the types of relationship I build is ridiculous. So I'm doing an analysis of myself too, as I engage in the process of interviewing, as I engage in the process of writing. And I think what's really funny as I sort of read the work of my supervisors and the difference between their interviews and my interviews, sure, the questions are a little different, but I'm interviewing Black students who see me as a Black student, right? They don't see me as a lecturer doing research or a professor doing research to get published. They see me as a comrade. They see me as a friend. So oftentimes I'm asking them these questions and I don't even need to ask. It's like we're having a conversation about the reality of our lives. So they're going, I had this experience, like, you know, and I'm sort of then I'm like, yeah, I know, you know. So there's a sort of shared, there's a camaraderie there that means that how they even tell me stories is different, right? There's pain, there's laughter, there's humor, you know, there's things that I know they say to me and that they're open to sharing with me that I know they wouldn't share with anyone else, because they see me not as oppositional, they see me as in the exact same situation, because I am a Black student. I am an exploited member of staff who teaches and who works for the university. And because I think even how existing in Britain as a Black person creates and cultivates a particular type of community and a particular type of meaning of Blackness also means there's a shared experience. And that's been fascinating to kind of behold.
Because I mean, this leads to something that, I mean, Dennis is here, so I think I can mention this because he's also working on it. This is something we've been working a lot in, and it has a counterpart in psychoanalysis, but it has a more general statement that we've been interested in, because in terms of psychoanalysis, it really caught my attention when you said that they kind of boxed some types of students as hysterics, like they are clearly taken up by the hysterics discourse. And you said, well, this looks to me more like the analyst discourse. Why do I say this? Because I think that possibly a development in Lacanian psychoanalysis will have to come from understanding, like giving more thoughts to the problem of the real of the analyst's desire, not the real of the patient's desire. For example, just to give a very brief vignette from, it's not even one case, it happens all the time. You have like a well-established, therefore white Lacanian analyst in Rio, has a very nice office, you know. Then this person comes from, you know, a very distant neighborhood, takes 2 bus rides, 2 hours to get to their office, gets to the first couple of interviews or comes to a session, and then they are very inhibited in what they're saying. They're having a hard time saying something. And then it's very common to hear from that analyst afterwards something like, clearly that person was touching on something real, because the real is the impasse of formalization. As if they couldn't say it, that means they cannot say it. And not that they cannot say it to me in my posh office with my, you know, white as hell face. Of course, there are things that are not at the level of what cannot be said and of the real. It's simply that the very form of the clinic constrains what gets to be spoken, and people will know what will be listened to and what won't be listened to. So they won't go to the trouble of not being heard on some things, right? And I think that the generalization of this that goes very much in line with what you said, and that has been interesting our research a lot, is the idea that only to some forms of organization, I mean, it's not like necessarily a personal trait. If you weren't at the same time kind of traversed by the contradictions of being a student, of being Black, of struggling there and so on, like this is a whole organizational structure. It's not something essential in itself. So if it takes certain organizational forms for some differences to make a difference, if you change the organization, suddenly some differences stop making a difference. You can even say it out loud, but it simply doesn't resonate. It won't latch onto the symbolic. And that has been a bit our kind of alternative basis to think what Lacan called the symbolic, which is a very delocalized, desituated, pretty ahistorical version of this, where there is no time and space, and more than time and space, because even if you give it temporal and spatial connotations, it can be overly cultural, as if there isn't like power relations, specific forces at play, and more than that, like a desire, as I said, for example, a comradely desire, right? So our take on that is that actually what we call the symbolic is just a local arrangement between some forms of organization to which some things make a difference. And if you remove that, suddenly it doesn't anymore. For example, we tried in this project I mentioned for, I think about 6 months, as an experiment, we said, okay, the university realized it was growing because the project was structured in such a way that students would listen to other students and redirect them to help by students, in the sense that, for example, I'm in the middle of my undergraduate courses, I can help you revise a text or correct your spelling or format something, because nobody ever bothered to teach you how to format the text or something like this, because it's meant for everyone to know, apparently. So you come to me, I'm a student, you're gonna probably tell me a bunch of, you know, not really meaningful stuff about your suffering, but then you feel like, okay, I'm not buying it. I know what you're talking about. I'm also experiencing it. Suddenly we have a bit more honest conversation. We get to see what you're actually going through. And then we redirect you to another student who's needing money, and he will help you and you will help him, right? So it was this sort of system. The university realized that this was growing, and they said, oh, we want to institutionalize it. The moment it was institutionalized and there was like an official university point of view to listen, it all stopped. Not because people were ill-intentioned, it's simply because you're not being heard by a structure that is, let's say, shaped in the form of something that can be affected by what you're talking about. That kind of underlying camaraderie ground disappears. So, I mean, what you're saying makes absolute sense to me. Like, it's such a crucial question.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Like, does that kind of imply that you can't move, or that comradeship negates the possibility of a party, or of political? In other words, it sounds like, you know, any belonging to an institution is negated by the presence of comradeship.
Well, you can have an institution of comrades. Why not?
Very nice.
Well, I think there's
right.
that.
I mean, I think that has something to do with the party.
There's that. There's
also
the question, I think, of what you might call the conditions by which free association occurs. And the presupposition of the analyst would be that that there is a kind of unthought racial incapacity or challenge that actually that has to be accounted for, which is why I think it was interesting when Deej, you said that the students gave you a different response because you shared a lived experience with them. And I wanted to actually raise the category of lived experience. I actually just did a podcast on sublation, where we talked about Jan Raymond's critique of Lacanian ideology, and I also gave a presentation on this as well to the subset of theoretical practice for which Gabriel's a part, and so is Dennis. And this guy, you know, philosopher who basically says that discourse theory in Lacan is problematic because it actually doesn't account for lived experience. And in a way, I guess it's very complicated because it's true in a certain sense. At least lived experience in a way is not to be trusted as such, in a way, right? And so I was wondering, Deej, maybe, and Gabriel, if you could chat or say more about this thorny category of lived experience, because I feel like it's here where psychoanalysis has so much debate internal to itself, like, you know, across like Winnicott to Lacan to Freud himself, Melanie Klein, you know what I mean? Like everyone would come at that maybe differently in some sense, and even Fanon. So I'm wondering how we might navigate the thorny category of lived experience, and like how you, Deej, have found that in this notion of how people are redefining Blackness, maybe.
Yeah. I think lived experience is a complex one. It's a complex one because it kind of means something different right now in this political age, and it's wielded as a political tool in a particular way that I kind of disagree with. And it's really interesting, actually. I was just reading a thing by Patricia Hill Collins, who talks about how lived experience has gotten muddled up with standpoint epistemology to make the case that because I'm a Black person, I can speak for Black people because I have the lived experience. What's been interesting in my research and in my readings, actually, and I have this wonderful friend called Annie who's doing her thesis on Blackness and Blackness through kind of history and the different and shifting meanings of Blackness. And she sent me this lecture by Stuart Hall, who spoke of race and more specifically Blackness as a floating signifier, which I found really interesting. So I started to like read kind of more of where he was getting those ideas from. I read Du Bois again, trying to understand what we mean when we say like blackness or something as a floating signifier. And what I got from that, and a similar thing to what Fanon talks about, he has this, he states in kind of the introductory chapter of Black Skin, White Masks, beyond ontogeny and phylogeny, we have sociogeny, speaking about the malleability of race in a particular kind of way. And that, coupled with Du Bois's lecture about race as this floating signifier, which operated in a discursive manner, was really important, because what he was speaking to is that race is like language in a specific way. As language shifts in meaning, language can ameliorate in meaning, words can ameliorate or become more pejorative in meaning. But what's interesting about race is, and how race operates, is that it carries its meanings with it. The meanings shift, but there's always that imprint of the previous meaning. There's always that imprint of what Blackness meant in a particular time that comes to render a Black experience through now. I think what's difficult about now is that whilst Blackness throughout history had specific meanings, there was a time in history where Blackness meant to be in a position of subordination. To be Black was to be a slave. There was a time where to be Black was to be proletarianized. There was a time where to be Black meant to be a colonized subject. And I think now we're seeing those fixtures and meaning of Blackness kind of waning a little bit, I find. So I think they still carry these imprints, but under this era, something new is happening to Blackness, and we're seeing multiple discourses of Blackness emerge. And she theorizes because, one, Blackness is abstracted, but also in the kind of world we're living in, there's this kind of eligibility of race that is kind of coming about, right? And we're seeing it within kind of whiteness as a concept is becoming rendered completely meaningless, and Blackness is kind of following a similar suit. So when we're talking about Blackness, when we say things like a Black community, what do we mean? Because that meaning right now, whilst has some significance to its history, is becoming harder and harder to actually accept. And she argues that actually it's this idea that Blackness has a cohesive and fixed meaning that allows things like Black bourgeois class to appoint themselves thought leaders and appoint themselves, you know, the spokesperson for this fictitious community. And that has been something that I've taken with me as I'm doing this project. So whilst I'm interrogating the student subjects, I'm not assuming something about Blackness either. I'm actually asking my participants, like, how do you racialize yourself? Like, what do you think your racial identity is? How do you account for that? How does that, you know, how do you make sense of that? What does that mean to you?
Can you say a little bit more about, like, just maybe the findings, like maybe a couple points about things that in the interviews that stand out to you? Could you say a couple things?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting is when it comes to speaking about the negative experiences of Blackness, there's an almost cohesive communitarian sort of feeling. When it comes to the possibilities of Blackness, when it comes to them thinking about themselves and their values and their future and where they want to go, then it becomes less legible. So that's really something I found really interesting. So for them, Blackness was able to be rendered legible when they were talking about particular experiences of oppression, particular experience of oppression that they assumed other Black people had, and it was oftentimes the case. But when it came to like thinking forward, when it came to thinking about where they want to go, thinking about, you know, what they want to do when they're done with the university and whether or not they think their Blackness would shape that experience. And then all of a sudden it kind of wasn't. And I found that to be quite interesting. And I think there's so much more work to be done on kind of exploring what Blackness means, especially because, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, in the current moment, a particular group of nihilistic thinkers have their grasps on kind of, you know, analysis of Blackness that is troubling.
Afro-pessimism.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's true, but they really interest me. I mean, the debates that I'm really curious about is, like, you know, for example, like Fred Moten's interlocution with them, and it's really productive dialogues in some ways. It would be so interesting to resurrect Frantz Fanon himself to see where he might fall on that divide if he were alive, right?
I don't think he'd be an Afro-pessimist.
Yeah. I want to open this up to everyone else. This has been so rich, and really, we've already gone like almost 50 minutes, if you can believe it or not. Really has flown by. So I invite, you know, Nick or Kayam or Dennis or Gabriel too, to sort of feel free to jump in. Before you do, you can just raise your hand or whatever. We have a great seminar coming up with Leon Brenner. I think maybe a couple of you have signed up. This is going to be 3 days of a Foucauldian deep dive into what's called the politics of diagnosis. And lots of readings, which I'm going to post very soon if you've signed up. It's sliding scale. It's not too expensive, but Leon, it's kind of like an all-star in my opinion. He's really great. He's been doing some of the most cutting edge stuff on autism research. And this will be interesting in part because I told him not to do something on autism. I'm like, what else do you have? And he came up with this idea, which fascinates me, to look at the history of where diagnosis actually came from. And so we'll get a sense of understanding these categories of like, okay, neurotic, psychotic, perverse, etc., and their prehistory. And then even in the last session, he's going to apply all of that to Badiou in an interesting way. So yeah, that's on the horizon. But I welcome others too. And Connor, welcome as well. And John. And I see my good friend who was recently on the show, Robert, as well. Robert, we'd love for you to chime in if you're available as well. And Robert actually...
Connor asked the question here.
Adding on to what I think Chaim was talking about, Connor says, transference is, of course, really important in the clinic. And I think transference would change its character in a more egalitarian situation. Talking student to student. Doesn't this changing character of transference pose some problems?
Yeah, I just to pitch in here, I think this question goes also, there's a connected issue that has everything to do with what we're talking about. It was very formative to me, this experience, because, you know, in Brazil, we were probably the country that dealt the worst with the dictatorship after it ended. A lot of countries in South America did like thorough, how do you call it? Like, you know, judgments of the people involved. Many of them were sentenced to jail or for torture and so on. And Brazil didn't do anything. And just very recently, we created something called a Truth Commission that deals with the horrors of the dictatorship, and people can come in and testify to what they went through, and some sort of reparation or measure is tried to take in with regards to this, even though pretty much nothing has happened. But one thing that we started realizing, and perhaps this was quite meaningful here because we have a very big Lacanian community, a very big psychoanalytic community, which was that is very much connected with the dictatorship in the sense that a lot of Lacan arrived in Brazil as a theory in the 70s. So a lot of them were fighting against the dictatorship as they were training to be analysts. And a lot of people realized that you could have a patient who was with you under analysis for like 10 years, and everything was kind of moving in their analysis. And then they decided to go before the Truth Commission and testify. And they would speak about what they went through in the dictatorship as if it happened yesterday. And they never worked through a day in their life. And people couldn't understand, like, how is it that they're doing analysis, they're working through all these things, they're talking about what they went through, torture or losing loved ones and things like this. And when it comes to testifying before this kind of public court or something like this, it's like this, you know, this kind of strange body of trauma is just there as if nothing touched it. And this was for me a very formative kind of impasse to see, because especially because I learned about this through a movement that was created, which was called the Testimony Clinic in Brazil, which was sometimes a group clinic, sometimes a individual clinic, but that was promoted by a group that was politically invested in the idea that something had to be done with regards to the effects of the dictatorship on people. And when people went to that clinic, which was pretty much the same, but with this kind of big banner on top saying, here in this space, this problem exists, right? Not only in the level of an image or a banner, but also in the sense that they were organized around it. That this problem existed was the very reason of being of that collective, right? And then when people went through that analytic process, suddenly they worked through those traumas. So why? What's the theory to explain that the transference in a private classical Lacanian clinic didn't do anything for these wounds, but actually being heard in that particular environment and not others shaped transference in such a way that things could be worked through.
Do you have a theory? Do you have a theory?
Yeah, I've been trying to work through this for a long time. I mean,
what's your speculative thought on this?
Yeah, this is exactly what we were saying before. It takes some forms of organization to be sensitive to some differences, and in other forms of organization, those differences don't make a difference. And I mean, this taught me a lot about transference in the regular kind of canonical sense of what happens in everyday practice, because we're very used to the idea that we know what a signifier is in Lacanian practice, meaning we're listening for what is significant. But it's not very clear what establishes the boundary between significance and insignificance. We only have a theory of the upper part of it, the positive part. But for example, it's clear that the fact that people sneeze in a session, or that they're speaking Portuguese, everyone is speaking Portuguese, that doesn't matter, that's insignificant. But in a slightly different context, if, for example, you are an analyst who sees Japanese immigrants in Brazil, the fact that they only speak Portuguese in their analysis, they never shift to Japanese, for example, that's actually significant that they're only speaking Portuguese in that analytic context, because you're tied to a community, you're tied in a structural sense to a place where that difference makes a difference. And all of a sudden, you're not allowed not to listen to that anymore, right? So suddenly you have a way of tracking together what makes a difference to a certain community, not necessarily in the direct conscious sense of what we want to make a difference, right? Because, for example, nobody wants the police to make a difference, but they do to some people much more than to others. That's not like a conscious decision. That's a structural thing. So you can track the connection between what makes a difference to a certain institution of psychoanalysts or to a certain, this kind of organizational background that shapes analytic listening, and what gets to be worked through in transference in those spaces. You cannot, so perhaps a way of framing this is to say, you cannot transfer something which doesn't have the shape of the clinic. The clinic is not in the shape of that problem, whatever shape means in that. I know it's doing a lot of work, the word. Still, if it cannot fit, you simply cannot touch upon it. Like what Freud said, you cannot analyze something in effigy, right? In absence. It needs to be able to be actualized in the clinical space. Well, but to actualize them, sorry, yeah.
Is this like, in other words, you're saying something that's bothering me, which is that there's a contingency here, right? You can't plan for it, you can't formalize, you can't theorize, you certainly cannot institutionalize that it happens to be that both the interviewer and the interviewee are both Black, or that they both speak Portuguese, right? This is a problem. No,
of course not. I mean, if you're in Brazil, you can have an analytic school. I mean, it's absolutely institutionalizable. That's why if we're listening to patients in Brazil, which has at least half of our population being Black, but I mean, it's clearly much more than that. And if you look at analytic schools, they're pretty much just white. I mean, that's not contingent at all. That's very much structural. So if you change that, on the one hand, the chances that you're going to be listening to patients differently changes together. It doesn't need to be treated in that contingent, in the most vulgar standpoint epistemological kind of sense. You can treat, that's what I like about this hypothesis. You keep the idea of standpoints, but you move it towards the organizations, not towards people. Right? Of course, again, exactly as Dij was saying, like you can be a ridiculously rich Black person, like a 1 in a million, and you're an analyst. I mean, you still might make people uncomfortable. You still are not going to be able to take what you're hearing back to your school and turn it into a problem for theorists to think about and for other analysts to think about. Like, it's a organizational, institutional circuit. So it's not an argument against institutions. On the contrary, it's an argument to show how relevant these institutional structural backgrounds are for things that in the current Lacanian theory are seen as this pure existential subjective things with no content. It's not true. It's true that they're negative, they're devoid of identity, many levels. I mean, a bourgeois analyst a bourgeois white male analyst still has a good handle on not identifying with a bunch of stuff. Kudos, like good for me, basically. But that's not the end of the issue, right? And we don't have theory to go with that.
I want to just make one recommendation that everybody go watch the new film which is very related to the themes we're talking about right now, called Adieu Lacan, which is a super interesting film about a Portuguese Lebanese woman in her 20s who was analyzed by Lacan in Paris, where she spoke not her native tongue, but she spoke French, obviously, in the exchange. And what is so interesting is based on a true story of Betty Milan.
She's Brazilian, man. She's not.
That's what I said. I said, no. I said she's Brazilian Lebanese. She's both.
Okay, sorry, I heard it wrong.
Yeah. No. She's Brazilian Lebanese. And that's actually very important because it actually is, in a beautiful sense, she wrote a play about it as well. Lacan comes out looking really good, if we might be, I don't know, cute about it, when it comes to these questions of third culture, alienation, cultural, racial issues. He understands things in that analysis, according to Betty, which were really sophisticated and made me have more respect for Lacan, honestly. I don't know if anybody has seen it on this call, but
yeah, I've seen it. It's really good. It's amazing.
It's very, very interesting because you really do see that Lacan actually was so sensitive to the complex alienation that she was experiencing precisely because of cultural stuff. She was seen as another in the Brazilian context. She's seen as a Brazilian in the French context in very different ways. She's overwhelmed by all of these things. But Lacan, anyways, I'm not going to say much more, but really was inspiring. Sorry, Dennis has a question. It's been for a while. Please, Dennis.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, I was really interested in this topic, and based on what the direction the conversation has been going, I'm tempted to suggest the term like political countertransference as a more generalized name. Like we normally think of, okay, countertransference as being a deviation from how analysis is supposed to work, but we could flip it around and say that countertransference is actually maybe the norm of everyday existence, right? In the sense that the fact of not being sensitive to certain differences is the normal case, the standard case. And it's only in a very particular situation that you can facilitate transference, right? Like a positive and productive form of this thing. And I think that's where we can maybe connect all these topics of like organization, what Gabriel said about the Truth Commission, what Khadijah said about university, as like these are like artificial ears that we have in the world, in which certain things are filtered out and other things are heard, right? And so the question of where politics intersects with psychoanalysis becomes like, how do we construct, or to use Gabriel's phrase, like how do we create these ears that can that are of the right shape to facilitate transference, which is it's a special case. It's almost like a miraculous case. And another aspect of this is like making the person feel legitimate. I mean, I think we can boil a lot of psychoanalytic theory down to, does the person who's speaking feel like what they're saying is legitimate? And in a lot of ways, Freud himself seemed to be the only one listening to women at the time, right? Like his success could be attributed to the basic fact that he like took what the hysteric said in a truth, in a mode of truth. And so creating an environment where that is possible seems to be like a very important political task.
Leave it to Dennis to create like a new concept, which is actually like extremely original. That's I'm not exaggerating. That's kind of like what Dennis does.
Yeah, very much in character.
Very much in character. political countertransference as a mode of everyday, it's extremely profound, Dennis. And I also, Khadijah, how are you doing? It's midnight where you are now.
I'm fine. I won't sleep till like 4 a.m. So we're fine.
Okay. Okay. So, wow, 4 a.m. But hopefully you get to sleep in a little bit. Hopefully.
Yeah, I do.
Well, Khadijah, we'll have to have you definitely on the podcast program to get into more depth on this really interesting bridging you're doing of theory and of empirical research. I don't know if Robert is still with us, because I know Robert has done a lot of the same stuff in America with Muslim youth.
Oh yeah, Robert, I should actually say Robert is actually a big inspiration of mine. And Robert, like I sought him out, and it was Robert's work on Islamophobia and the 4 discourses that gave me that kind of feeling that, oh, I actually can do Lacan in the way I'm doing it, because everyone was telling me, don't do Lacan like this, you know. There was a lot of things that I just did not agree with in my inception into this new world of psychoanalysis.
So now Khadijah, I can have you back on for like a comradely exchange with Robert. Then we can have.
Yes, I'd absolutely love to. I love Robert. Like, yeah.
Yeah, it's nice to virtually meet you here.
Yes.
How's it going?
I'm good.
Amazing. Well, that is something we can do, Robert. But I don't know if you wanted to. Well, hello. How are you, by the way?
Yeah. No, I enjoyed very much the exchange, and I don't have a question per se. So
it's all good. Robert's doing some interesting stuff on Egypt and psychoanalysis, which we're eager to learn more how that's going to come together. Yeah. So I mean, if folks have other questions, I also do want to respect time, actually, because we did say was to keep it relatively short to an hour. So I'm happy to, let me see, we have a few points in the chat. Kayam, did you get your question answered about data?
No, I didn't see that one.
Just it was just a thought for Gabriel and Deja about this question about the institution and the individual, the comrade, and the school.
Yeah.
You know, just to complement something on this, because of you guys brought up the idea of lived experience, and just don't want to kind of also suggest something which I think would be, Dennis mentioned countertransference, which I think is very relevant, which is, of course, like, it's a very interesting but complicated kind of line to walk between sharing, let's say, being in a position, or using this term we're using a lot, like being organized in a certain way that some things make a difference, and a more vulgar idea that you're simply there with the person and you're like agreeing with everything because simply at this imaginary level you feel like you share everything, right? That's where I think the idea of lived experience, as you said, then you're like, it's important to have some stakes on it on the one hand, because as we've seen, it's good to track these differences and how, for example, if you shift the ground of experience below the same discourse, it can shift the position of enunciation for the same statement. But on the other hand, it also is, let's say, the battleground between a sort of mere confirmation of how lived experience is filtered through consciousness, right? And the much more comradely, but also tense position of trusting people without believing them, which is, I mean, the weird thing we do a lot, right? I mean, to validate, as Dennis was saying, doesn't mean to take everything at face value. So the weird thing is that I think a lot of analysts, I mean, if you go into this discussion, I think it's ultimately, if we boil down to the most fundamental problem, it has to do with our concept of what love is. I mean, we're very impressed at the fact that we can produce a sort of love in a lab with a clinic, but it's just some properties of love. It's not love per se. And to mistake transferential love for love, I think it's something where we like to do because it makes us feel very important, as if we know something about it. But it actually, it has consequences for this issue, because you can think that it's because you have no relation to the patient or no stakes in an analysis, that there is no common ground, that you are in a position to trust without believing, to interject or to make an intervention that goes against identifications, that puts the person into question and so on. But as everyone knows, it takes a lot of connection to actually, but a very precise, non-imaginary sort of connection to actually intervene on something which is on the benefit of somebody, but against their immediate interest sometimes, right? So I think that conundrum of how to think through the problem, and if taking Dennis's kind of cue on, you know, big words and big new concepts, something like this real comrade kind of feeling, which is not a feeling really, it's actually something that you need to do. But this structure in the real, right, which is, there is some connection there, and it's because there is some ground that you can let go of something on a other level, right? You can undo things in the symbolic because something is done in the real, not because things are undone in the real. Of course, the effect of this is that the real is undoing something symbolic, but it's this very punctual concept of the real in Lacan, which makes it seem like every time that there is structure to resistance, it's hysteric. Exactly as Khadijah was saying, like, there, of course, it's many people saying things. It's not like just a mute resistance. That doesn't mean it's just the symbolic kind of negotiating with the other from a hysteric point of view. It's a trick Lacanians play. Every time there's structure, you say this cannot be real. But in politics, it's real and there is structure, right? Otherwise, there is no such a thing as organized politics. So I think that this is a big challenge for Lacanian theory as well, and probably the crucial place where it needs to learn from everyone else, rather than try to, dictate the terms of the conversation, because we don't know how to keep it real, in the sense that this is coming from beyond identifications, beyond symbolic arrangements, but there is still some structure there, something that you need to maintain, care for, take into consideration, right? So I think that this idea of there's some sort of camaraderie that is a condition for some forms of listening. It doesn't entail an imaginary pact. On the contrary, it's a condition for undoing that sort of thing. And it's hard to distinguish the two, right? It's hard to distinguish. You can, I mess it up all the time. So I find it very hard to know the thin line between thinking of yourself as a caring analyst or extending too much of a hand because you cannot bear to see the person suffering or being disappointed. And that's all whole counter-transferential dynamic. And this underlying thing, which is not that, right? Which, for example, might lead you to suspend payment so that analysis can go on. It's because you and the patient are engaged with psychoanalysis. It's not because you're like being the nice person, you cannot bear to see the other person. So they're going to suffer much more because they're continuing analysis, in fact, right? So there is something in that mix there, which I find theoretically still deficient, especially in Lacanian psychoanalysis. It has to do with very profound problems. And I don't think it's going to be solved by just pushing the theory and saying like Fanon was a Lacanian. Everyone who did something good was a Lacanian, basically, right? It's probably going to be the other way around, where, yeah, just to reinforce that.
Well, that actually gives me opportunity to put Gabriel on the spot, because that's what I like to do here. Since I'm the host, Gabriel may be writing a book on love and psychoanalysis, so we should all encourage him to do that project, because we need that actually. Because in fact, we need to get you a big research grant to just like,
if anyone finds some money laying around there that I can use, it would be really helpful.
Maybe we need to start applying for grants for SGPP.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay. Well, look, unless anyone has any final points, I have to go feed the family. And I just want to say this has been really fun and meaningful for me personally to bring this together. And I hope you all, join us for future events. And Khadijah, we definitely want to bring you back into our orbit. And I think definitely it was serendipitous that you have this research, which I only knew a little bit about, and how nice it gelled with Gabriel's stuff. So
no, absolutely. And I'm so glad to have met all of you, and you especially, Gabriel, because as a non-psychoanalyst coming into psychoanalysis, I'm often like, there are these glaring issues that no one seems to want to deal with that are quite obvious to me coming from a different space. And all of the things that have troubled me about Lacan are things that you've articulated quite well. I remember in my sort of like initial stages of the PhD, I wanted to write like a critique of the analyst and the analysand. And my supervisor's like, no, we don't do that. But now I'm rethinking it. And I think I'm taking away with me, most significantly, how I can, I suppose, reify how I conceptualize lived experience for the purposes of this project. And I'm thinking of it less as you say, a sort of symbolic attachment based on a shared imaginary, and rather that the signifiers are different, right? The signifiers I look for based on my experience have given me a familiarity with the symbols, if you like. So the symbols I look for as a Black researcher, as a Black student, speaking to other Black students, is going to be very different to the symbols and the signifiers that someone who doesn't have that experience is looking for. And I think that's where the work becomes more sufficient. That's where, I can sort of escape the kind of critiques that may be leveraged about transferring a particular position or receiving a particular position, actually saying, no, my experience makes me look at language differently. It makes me look at the symbols differently. And I think that is what we need to do as psychoanalysts, understand that in different contexts, in different cultural, situational, linguistic contexts, the symbols are going to be different, the language is going to be different, and the structures are going to appear differently to different people because of the symbols.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm look, regardless of what Daniel does, I'm probably going to just message you at some point just to get to know a bit more your research, because we really need it here. And I'm really curious to see how much, the context match and how things are applied through this context. So
absolutely.
Yeah, I'll know you in the near future.
Okay.
But it was a pleasure, guys. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Likewise. Thank you all very much. And until the next time, until we meet again, have a great night, and we'll be in touch. Thank you, Khadijah and Gabriel. It was great.
So much.
Goodbye.